This is Big Tasty Sports.
Welcome to another edition of The Turnover Effect. This is a show where we look at a variety of angles related to turnovers in the NFL. I've gone over this in previous videos and started to get into this last year. The turnover differential has a disproportionate effect on the outcome of games. Maybe sometime I'll make another video that goes back through specifically laying out how big that impact is. But turnovers are definitely something that is difficult to predict. But because of the big impact that they have, I think it's worth diving in. Today, we're going to be looking at turnover statistics from last year and some of the outliers where there is a likelihood of regression on some of these teams. And obviously, we'll talk some about the teams change. The strength of the teams matters, all that kind of stuff. So it's not all cut and dried. But if you're serious about capping NFL and finding edges with these teams, this is one of the things that I think that you should be looking at, whether you fully agree with me or not. It's something that absolutely has a big impact on the game. I would say a greater impact than injuries to non-quarterbacks for the most part, maybe some other absolute stars in the league. So we're going to dive into another aspect of that today. Before we do, check out bigtastysports.com if you have not done that already. The main thing that I have going on right there, well, there's a lot of free stuff. There's the blog, there's videos, all that kind of stuff. But I'm working hard to build a strong futures portfolio and want to help you to be able to do that too. Right now, if you use the code July until the end of this month, you can get 25% off of your first 3 months. It's just $10 a month. And obviously, you can cancel at any time. We're over 30 futures bets in already. Only one of those has moved the wrong direction for me. And so would love to have you jump on board. So check that out if you would like to. With that said, let's jump into the turnover effect, teams that will win and lose on turnover regression in 2023. In order to really get into this well, I'm going to have to do a little bit of math here. And it's not too much. Hopefully you can stick with me. If you don't want any math, I think that the rest of this, you'll still be able to get it even without the math. So you could skip until we get past this next slide, which is about standard deviations. But if you want to stay with me for a minute, I think this will make sense. A standard deviation is just a way of measuring what a group of teams that fall a certain distance from the mean outcome, which is the average outcome. So today what we're looking at is turnovers. And so we're going to be talking about with turnovers, takeaways, and turnover differential, how far do teams fall from the average in the league last year? Here's why this is important. If you go one standard deviation out from the middle there, and if you're watching the YouTube video, you can see this graph. If you're on the podcast, just imagine a nice bell curve. You go one standard deviation out, and it's 34.1% on either side. So one standard deviation in either direction accounts for 68.2% of all outcomes. That means when we get into these different teams, if they're more than one standard deviation out from the mean in either direction, they are falling outside the majority of the outcomes in the NFL last year. And so when we talk about regression, the further you are away from average, the more likely you are to have regression that brings you back toward the middle. Now, where it gets really interesting is if you go two standard deviations out from the middle, you get to 95.4% of outcomes. So we are talking about all but 4.6% of outcomes. If you get teams that are two standard deviations away from the mean in any of these categories, the likelihood of regression is high, regardless of the team. Now, the amount of regression may be impacted by how good or bad a team is, the additions or subtractions that they've had and all that kind of stuff, coaching. But the likelihood of some regression would be very high once you get two standard deviations out. So I share this mathy stuff to just establish that what I'm going to be talking about today is teams in some categories that are at least one standard deviation, if not two standard deviations out. And because of that, we can believe that there's a likelihood of regression toward the middle, and that will impact the performance of these teams this year. Obviously, in the NFL, there are no sure things. That's not my point here. But the point is, overall in averages, regression is likely the further you move out. All right, that's the math. Let's put that behind us and move on to some football. What I want to talk about first is teams that were two or more standard deviations out from the mean in turnovers. So on the top there, I have green, which means that this was positive for these teams. They didn't turn the ball over very much. And on the bottom are teams that turned the ball over a lot, or a team in this case. Let's talk about these. First up is the Detroit Lions. They were 2.01 standard deviations out, which again, going back means that they fell in like a 5% likelihood of being in there. I talked on the previous video about quarterbacks, how Jared Goff did a great job of not turning the ball over. And a lot of the Lions' success was due to the fact that they didn't turn it over more than that they took it away a ton. I think they're hoping with some of their additions in the defensive secondary that they might be able to, and even on the defensive line, they might be able to cause some more havoc and maybe get some more turnovers this year. Jared Goff has been showing consistent progression in this area. So, well, I do think it's likely that he may have some regression and that the Lions in general will, where they'll turn the ball over a little bit more. I think they can still have a good year in this regard. They seem to be a team that does take care of the ball. And if they can increase their takeaways a little bit, that's going to mitigate it. So I think there should be a positive outlook on the Lions when it comes to turnovers, but maybe we just have to realize that they got a lot of help last year from the turnovers. And then they still, were decent. They came on strong at the end of the year. So everyone's expecting a lot out of them. I think this is something to pay attention to. The other one that I put on here is the Giants, and I lied a little bit here, straight up. They weren't quite 2 standard deviations out. They were, 1.72. There it is. But they were just 1 turnover away from being in that 2 standard deviation range. So Daniel Jones is another guy that took care of the ball. It was pretty even between fumbles and interceptions for the Giants. And I think it's really indicative of the fact that they were able to be as good as they were last year. This is a team that I already talked about personally, at least on the NFC East video. I think there's some regression coming for this team, period. I like Brian Daboll, and they have some nice pieces on that team. There's no doubt. But I don't expect Daniel Jones to continue as positively as he has. I think he's an average NFL quarterback. But they had some good turnover, whether you want to call it skill or luck, probably a little bit of both last year. I think that regresses some. I think this team regresses some, which is why I'm not very high on the Giants. And then on the bottom, man, the Colts. Okay, so we talked about going 2 standard deviations out. You go 3 out, and it's a 99.8% of the outcomes are contained in there. So the Colts were 3.03 standard deviations under the mean, which is bad. So they were in the 0.2 of all outcomes, 0.1 of the negative. I know that's a lot of math again, but it's really shitty. That's how we could break it down. The Colts turned the ball over at a historic rate last year. Now, bringing in Anthony Richardson, if they play him, are they going to play him or Minshew? It'll be interesting to see, because Richardson had problems with turning the ball over in college. And so if they bring him in, I mean, honestly, you stick almost anyone in there at quarterback, and it wasn't all the quarterback's fault. There were fumbling issues as well. But there has to be some regression back toward the mean. Like, it can't be as bad as it was last year. And so I think the turnovers could be something that are a little bit kinder to the Colts this year than they were last year, though I'm not really high on this team as a whole. But man, when you go back and look at their record last year, I think you have to take into consideration how bad they were on the turnover front. And any team that turned the ball over at the rate they did, maybe except for the Chiefs, because the Chiefs seem to overcome even turnover issues, it would have had a massive impact. So the Colts had a rough year. Turnovers were not the only reason why, but man, it was a big reason why. It was historically bad on the turnover front for the Colts. So that's the teams that were, well, except for the Giants, 2 or more standard deviations out from the average, the mean on turnovers. Let's go next to takeaways. Only 1 logo on this graphic. Holy shit, the Dallas Cowboys. They had 35 takeaways last year. Remember how I said at 3 standard deviations, it would be 0.2 of all the outcomes that they're in? Well, Dallas was at 2.83 standard deviations with 35 takeaways. I mean, just an absolutely insane season when it came to taking the ball away. I've talked before, I did in the quarterback video, about how Dak Prescott had a historically bad season when it came to turning the ball over. And so what's amazing is that the Cowboys defense mitigated those difficulties from Dak Prescott with the rate at which they took the ball away. Now, the Dallas defense is really good. We broke this down in the NFC East video. Really good defensive line, good linebackers. Brought in Stephon Gilmore to hold down the other side across from Trayvon Diggs. So good, really good secondary even. The possibility that they take the ball away a lot, again, is absolutely there. This is a team that should have a pretty large number of takeaways. They can get pressure with the defensive line. They can cause havoc. And then they have a defensive secondary that has an eye for the ball and can go take it away. So I'm very positive on the Cowboys being on the positive side of the ledger when it comes to takeaways again this next season. However, again, when you're at a 0.2% outcome, there almost has to be some regression. And so while I think the Cowboys will be good again, I think this is something that comes back to earth a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and talk about this now. The Cowboys are going to be on the next graphic again, but I'm going to just say this now. I think the thing that could keep them in a really positive place in regard to turnovers, though, is that I think they may be able to dial back the giveaways this year. I think Dak could have a better season where they're not turning the ball over as much as they did either. And so their overall turnover differential, I think, could still end up being really good. I just don't think we should expect this defense, or probably any other, to have 35 takeaways again. It was a phenomenal season for the Cowboys defense when it came to the takeaways. All right, now let's get to the thing that really matters, which is turnover differential. Because the reality is I can turn the ball over a lot, but like I just said with the Cowboys, if my defense takes it away more, we still are in a good spot. If my defense can't get turnovers, but I don't turn the ball over, I'm in a good spot. So what really matters is the turnover differential. We're going to start with the teams here that are one standard deviation or more out from the middle. On the positive side, and I'm not going to talk about every single one of these teams, but I am going to just call out a few that I think are interesting. On the positive side, you have the Bengals, the Lions, the Patriots, the Eagles, and the 49ers. Let's talk about the Patriots first. I think they need something like this to happen, and they should have a good defense again. So I think that they can definitely get some takeaways, but I don't think very highly of their offense. We'll see what Bill O'Brien can do coming in as, a really solid offensive coach and coordinator. So maybe that can help some. But I think the Patriots are a team that is average to below average this year. And if they can't keep this up, this kind of turnover differential being positive in that, I think it's going to spell trouble for them, and that they will probably end up below their win total, especially just because they play in such a hard division and the AFC overall is so difficult. So this is something to watch, because I think the Patriots need this to happen in order to have a good record. Well, maybe some of these other teams are good enough to overcome it, even if they don't do it. The other one is the 49ers. They were actually, let's see, I don't have it written down. I think they were close to 2 standard deviations, actually. They were really close. It'll be interesting to see if Brock Purdy can play the way that he did last year, if he's the one who ends up playing, which I'm kind of assuming he will be. This is a really good defense. I'm sure that they will take the ball away again, but I really wonder if San Francisco turns it over a little bit more than they did last year. Probably, especially in the NFC, a good enough team to overcome it regardless, and I feel that way certainly about the Bengals and the Eagles as well. Let's talk about the teams who are on the negative side. You have the Chiefs, the Raiders, the Dolphins, the Colts, the Jets, and the Commanders. A couple that I'll call out here. I think that Miami and the Jets, if they can be on the positive side of turnover differential instead of the negative side, have such high upside this year. And yes, they play in a phenomenally difficult division. But I talked about on the QB video that Aaron Rodgers is, over the last 4 seasons, and even beyond for him, the absolute best in the league at taking care of the ball. He had a little bit of a down year last year, and he was still league average. You bring in a guy that historically has been the best in the league at taking care of the ball to go in place of Zach Wilson, and I think it's worth multiple games to have that. Because, again, when you lose the turnover differential, even by 1, you go down to about a 30% chance of winning, and when you lose it by 2, it's like 13%. So, or maybe it was 16%. Sorry, that's not the video I'm on. So give me a grace of a few percentage points there. The point is, it's a big difference when you lose that turnover battle. If the Jets can be up on the positive side this year, I think that's at least a few game swing because of the position they'll put themselves in with a Hall of Fame quarterback, even if he is diminishing a little bit, a really good defense and some good skill position players. Kind of similar for Miami. Obviously, they went out and got Jalen Ramsey, and so I think that their defense can up their game, get some more turnovers this year, and that puts Miami, which has a very explosive offense, in a good position to be able to win games. I mean, Miami's a team you don't want to give extra chances to be able to score. So turning the ball over against a team like Miami is really bad news. There might be a team like the Colts that are on here where you turn the ball over and it doesn't help, but you might not feel too bad because you think you could probably stop them again. The Dolphins, that's going to be much more difficult. And then the last thing I'll say is with the Chiefs, they're down here. They're the one team where it just really doesn't matter. In all the turnover stats that I've been running and the things that I look at, they just win anyway. They defy the odds when it comes to the effect that turnover differential has on a game and has on a team. So, man, if they're on the other side of this, they're just even more of a juggernaut. But I think it doesn't factor in too much for them, even if they end up in a similar place this year that they did last year. So the Jets and Miami are two teams to watch for if they can get more on the positive side here and have some regression back toward the middle or even toward the positive when it comes to turnover differential. On the next slide, I've got two teams that were two or more standard deviations out, one in the positive, one in the negative, and I think these are very interesting. I already talked about the Cowboys. They were in the positive. Like I said, I see them still probably being on the positive side of the turnover battle with turnover differential because that defense is so good and because I think the Dak can have a better season and not turn the ball over quite as much. I don't expect them to get quite as much help as they did last year, but I think that that's where they end up. The Saints are a super interesting one to me to talk about. So the Saints are the only team that ended up in the red in terms of turnover differential, minus 2.08 standard deviations below the mean. And this is a team that a lot of people are looking at as potentially having a high upside. And some of that is because they play in the NFC South and it's such a bad division that they think they can go ahead and take it. Obviously, this had a huge impact on the Saints season last year to be turning the ball over this much and be playing from such a bad position. I was going to see if I can, I don't have it up anymore in terms of which games they specifically won and lost based on turnovers, but you can't be that far out and be better. Now, they bring in Derek Carr, and you would think, okay, Derek Carr is going to be a stabilizing force, and they certainly aren't going to turn the ball over as much with him in town. Well, the interesting thing is that Carr had 14 interceptions in 15 games last season, easily his worst year when it came to interceptions, and just about as bad, almost as bad as any quarterback in the league. Not the very worst, but way up there. That was an outlier for him. He hasn't been phenomenal when it comes to not turning the ball over, but he's been about league average, and he was near the bottom of the league last year. That could have been the Raiders falling apart, maybe the offensive line not performing. If he gets time, I think he can be better, but he needs to be. This is a team that needs to take care of the ball, and if they can do that, I think they do have some high upside. And as I've said with other teams, again, we have to consider all the factors of the makeup of the team, especially the quarterback and all that kind of stuff. But when you're this far out from what's normal, we should expect some regression back toward the mean. And so even if the Saints aren't, I mean, what if they're in the middle of the league or even slightly below average in terms of turnovers? It's going to put them in a significantly better position than they were in last year with a really weak division. And along with the Falcons, two of the easiest schedules in the league this year. So while I don't look at the Saints as a team that I expect to challenge for the Super Bowl or anything like that, and honestly, at 9.5, I've said I'm not interested in their over, but I understand why their over is set at 9.5 because of that easy schedule. And I think, again, this is only one factor, but this turnover differential plays into it as well. If they take care of the ball a little bit more, they're just going to win more games. That's the way that goes. So those are some of the stats when it comes to turnovers and where there could be some regression. definitely will be interesting to watch what happens with the Saints and the Cowboys. And then, like I said, I think the Jets and the Dolphins are two teams where when you're capping football or thinking about what you'd want to bet or how you look at this season, those are two teams that are worth paying attention to what happened with turnovers for them last year and how that might be different this year, mostly because of changes on the defense for Miami and because of bringing in Aaron Rodgers to replace Zach Wilson. Hopefully that info is helpful. Always love to hear your comments, what you're thinking as we move closer and closer to this NFL season. Have a great week, and I will talk to you again soon.